When Eddie Griffin heard Malcolm-Jamal Warner had died, he didn't grieve like everyone else. He didn't call it a tragedy, he called it a war. And he wasn't wrong. Because behind the smiles, the sitcoms, and the sanitized headlines, Malcolm and Eddie were soldiers, two black men trying to survive inside a machine designed to break them. For 4 years, they bowed and prayed before every taping, not for fame, but for protection. Now one of them is dead, the other is done being silent. Eddie's tribute wasn't a eulogy, it was a battle cry. And what he revealed about Malcolm's final months, his poetry, his politics, his war against Hollywood's psychological warfare, proves this wasn't just a drowning, it was an execution. On the surface, Malcolm and Eddie was just another buddy sitcom, but behind the scenes, it was a war zone. Malcolm-Jamal Warner and Eddie Griffin weren't just co-stars, they were two black men locked in daily battles against Hollywood's stereotypes. Every episode was a fight. Every script was a negotiation. The studio didn't want upliftment, they wanted performance. Characters that danced, clowned, and sold out. Malcolm refused, Eddie rebelled. But resistance came with a cost. The network killed the show after 88 episodes, just 12 short of syndication. That cutoff wasn't random, it was a financial assassination. Syndication meant generational wealth. But Malcolm and Eddie didn't play by the rules, and the machine doesn't reward rebels. What they wanted was control over their image, their art, their legacy. What they got was censorship, sabotage, and silence. And yet, before every taping, these two men who barely spoke off camera would bow their heads and pray together. Not for ratings, for protection. Because they both knew something the public didn't. They weren't just entertainers, they were soldiers on enemy ground. And Malcolm, long before his final breath, was already fighting for his life. Malcolm-Jamal Warner wasn't supposed to go out like this. He wasn't spiraling, fading, or irrelevant. In fact, during his final year, he was louder, sharper, and more fearless than ever. But not in the way Hollywood likes. He wasn't chasing roles. He was challenging the system. His Instagram wasn't promotional fluff. It was poetry, protest, and personal truth. He spoke directly to the pain of being black in America. He called out the music industry's glorification of destruction. He questioned narratives, exposed manipulation, and pushed back against everything they wanted him to stay silent about. This wasn't a midlife crisis. It was a man stepping fully into his purpose. And that made him dangerous. Too dangerous. Because the Malcolm who once played it smart and safe had stopped being diplomatic. And when you're a black man in Hollywood who refuses to perform, you're not just ignored. You're targeted. His last posts weren't vague sadness. They were warnings, coded messages from someone who knew the walls were closing in. 3 days later, he was found face down in Costa Rican waters. The headlines called it a drowning, but Eddie Griffin called it what it really was. The final phase of a war Malcolm never stopped fighting. Eddie Griffin didn't need to name names. He didn't need to scream or accuse. His tribute said everything. He called Malcolm a warrior, a brother, a man who went to battle with him, not in Hollywood, but against it. Every word was strategic, every sentence laced with the kind of language you don't use unless you're signaling something deeper. This wasn't mourning. It was a coded message to those paying attention. For years, Eddie had warned anyone who would listen. Black entertainers don't leave the industry clean. The system either breaks you or buries you. He'd talked about Cosby, Prince, Michael Jackson, men who rose too high, got too loud, and were taken out in plain sight. Now Malcolm had joined the list. Eddie wasn't surprised. His Instagram post wasn't crafted by a publicist, it was written like he'd already prepared it. Because when you watch your brothers fall one by one, you stop being shocked. You start waiting. And when the call came, when Malcolm's name hit the headlines, Eddie didn't flinch. He fired back with the one thing the machine can't control, the truth, raw and unfiltered, wrapped in the grief of a man who saw this coming years ago. Throughout his career, Malcolm carefully balanced truth with diplomacy, navigating the treacherous terrain of Hollywood by choosing his battles wisely and speaking only when it felt safe. But in the final year of his life, that caution began to fade. He no longer tiptoed around uncomfortable truths or softened his message to appease the industry. Instead, he embraced the role of a warrior, one who had nothing left to lose and everything left to say. His social media presence shifted dramatically. No longer just a place for career updates or family snapshots, it became a platform for exposing the psychological warfare he had quietly endured for decades. Through poetry and prose, he called out the systems of degradation embedded in entertainment, questioned the values promoted by the music industry, and challenged the notion that success had to come at the cost of dignity. These were not idle reflections. They were intentional acts of resistance from a man who had grown tired of surviving in silence. Malcolm understood that speaking this boldly would come with consequences, especially for someone with his visibility and influence. He wasn't a fringe figure. He was Theo Huxtable, a cultural symbol whose unraveling would not go unnoticed. And yet, he chose to speak anyway, knowing the risk. As Hollywood faced mounting scrutiny and its darkest secrets began to surface, Malcolm's voice became more urgent, more direct, and more disruptive. His final posts weren't just warnings, they were declarations from a man who had finally stopped whispering and started roaring. Malcolm-Jamal Warner didn't just wake up one day and decide to fight the system. He had been resisting it his entire career. But in his final year, something shifted. The man who once navigated Hollywood with careful diplomacy became uncompromising, unfiltered, and fearless. His Instagram posts transformed from poetic reflections to public indictments of the very system that once embraced him. His podcast episodes began peeling back the psychological layers of entertainment industry programming. He was no longer playing safe. He was naming names, exposing patterns, and using every platform available to push back against a machine that profits from silence. He didn't do it recklessly. He did it knowing exactly what he was risking. When someone as respected as Malcolm, someone with a clean image, no scandals, no public meltdowns, starts speaking out, the system takes notice. He wasn't just a whistleblower, he was a beloved figure, a household name, and a man whose credibility made him especially dangerous. The usual tools of reputation destruction couldn't touch him, so the machine did what it always does when character assassination fails. It moved to phase 2. 3 days before his body was found in the waters of Costa Rica, Malcolm posted a video telling his followers to keep smiling no matter how hard life gets. It wasn't optimism, it was code. That video wasn't a pep talk, it was a farewell. And when Eddie Griffin saw it, he knew exactly what had happened. Malcolm had become a threat too big to tolerate, not because of what he'd done, but because of what he represented. A conscious black man, beloved by millions, refusing to bow. And in Hollywood, that kind of defiance has only one ending. When Eddie Griffin heard the news, he didn't rush to release a polished PR statement or offer some generic condolences like most celebrities. There were no publicists, no rehearsed lines, just raw, unfiltered grief. And beneath it, something far more dangerous. Because Eddie didn't just lose a friend, he lost a fellow soldier in a battle they'd been fighting for decades. And his tribute wasn't a eulogy, it was confirmation that Malcolm's death was no accident. It was the machine's final solution. Eddie called him a warrior, not a colleague. He said they went to war together, not performed. He didn't use entertainment industry buzzwords, he used military code. Because that's what this really was. Not a career, a battlefield, not a death, an elimination. Eddie's language told the story no obituary ever would. And the speed of his response proved this wasn't unexpected. It was inevitable. Like a man who'd been waiting for the call, dreading the day it would come, but knowing it was always coming. In the days before his death, Malcolm had been more vocal than ever. Through poetry, podcast interviews, and Instagram videos, he laid bare the psychological warfare that's been waged against Black entertainers for decades. He named the patterns, he exposed the playbook. He stood as a credible witness during a time when the machine was already under federal investigation, when Diddy's connections to Epstein were being unraveled, when Hollywood's darkest corners were being forced into the light. Malcolm's final messages weren't signs of a man at peace. They were the coded cries of someone who knew he was being watched, hunted, and ultimately silenced. And Eddie knew it. He recognized the signs, he saw the pattern. He'd warned us this would happen. And when it did, he didn't hesitate to speak the truth because someone had to. In a world that buries its rebels with headlines and forgets them with reruns, Eddie Griffin refused to let Malcolm-Jamal Warner become another casualty lost to silence. He called it what it was, a hit, a war crime. And with that truth, he made sure the battle doesn't end here.